The heat shimmered over the city of Foxbridge like an invisible blanket, making the asphalt glisten in the midday light. Keanu Reeves, owner of a multi-billion-dollar network of car dealerships, sat behind the wheel of his old SUV. His car looked like it had seen better days a decade ago, but Keanu was content. He wasn't interested in status symbols when he was on a mission. Today, he wanted to see reality. Before him loomed the flagship dealership of Arum Autos, one of the most prestigious in his network. The facade of the building gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting the wealth it promised its clients. The smooth lines of the glass showcases framed the shiny cars like jewelry on a podium. Keanu parked his car in the far corner of the lot, away from the glitz and glamour. He stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his simple black t-shirt and slightly worn jeans. A light breeze rustled his leather jacket, but despite the heat, he felt comfortable. As he approached the building, Keanu paused for a moment, surveying the facade. Everything looked perfect. Perfectly clean, perfectly maintained, perfectly orchestrated. But he knew that behind every shine, there was something more complex. That's what he had come to check. As soon as he entered, the door chimed softly and then closed smoothly behind him. Inside, it was cool thanks to the air conditioning, and the scent of freshly tanned leather and car polish instantly filled the air. The showroom was spacious and bright, with rows of shiny cars displayed in perfect order. The floor was so polished that it reflected the neon lights highlighting each car. Keanu moved slowly through the exhibition hall, trying not to draw attention to himself. A group of employees gathered at the reception desk. Their conversation sounded subdued, interspersed with occasional bursts of laughter. However, their casual interaction was interrupted as soon as Keanu entered. Voices hushed, and he caught brief, wary glances in his direction. A faint shadow of disdain flickered in the eyes of one of the employees before they turned away. Keanu didn't react. He was used to such looks, to those who made quick judgments about people. He walked along the row of cars, studying not so much the vehicles as the atmosphere. Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at the employees, who had resumed their conversation, but were now watching him surreptitiously. Her heels sounded like gunshots in the quiet hall when Eloise Beckett, the sales manager, emerged from an adjacent office. She was a middle-aged woman with impeccably styled chestnut hair and a stern gaze. Her gray suit fit her perfectly, and the tablet in her hands completed her professional look. Eloise moved confidently, her posture and brisk steps betraying someone used to giving orders. Her gaze instantly landed on Keanu. A faint shadow of irritation flickered across her face, barely noticeable to anyone but those accustomed to reading people. But Keanu noticed. He continued to examine the car, pretending not to notice her approach. "Excuse me," she said in an even tone that sounded more like business formality than genuine greeting. "Can I assist you with something?" Keanu turned to her, smiling faintly. "Just looking," he replied calmly, nodding to the cars in front of him. Her gaze slid over his outfit, faded t-shirt, jeans that had seen better days, and worn boots. Apparently, she had made her conclusions, even before he could say a second sentence. "Are you looking for something specific?" she asked, her voice remaining professional, but her tone betraying restrained skepticism. Keanu shrugged slightly. "Something like that," he said, not losing an ounce of confidence. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and he caught that barely perceptible movement of her eyebrows, a mix of surprise and disbelief. However, Eloise quickly regained her professional expression. "We have exclusive models here," she began. "Our entire range is designed for a very specific clientele." Keanu met her gaze, saying nothing. The tension in the air became increasingly palpable. "Perhaps," she continued, pausing, "you might find offers from a more affordable segment more suitable?" He slightly raised an eyebrow, but his faint smile did not disappear. "Do you think you know what I need?" he asked with a hint of amusement in his voice. Eloise frowned slightly, her face becoming a bit colder. "I'm just trying to save your time," she replied with a strained smile. "These cars start at 6 figures. Perhaps I can suggest another dealership for you." Keanu nodded slowly, as if digesting her words. "Interesting," he murmured. "Well, if it's not too much trouble, call the owner. I would like to speak with him personally." Eloise blinked, clearly stunned by this statement. For a moment her confidence wavered, but she quickly regained her composure. The owner, she repeated in disbelief. He doesn't spend time here. It's impossible. Keanu pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. Eloise froze, her gaze shifting from him to the other employees, trying to assess how to proceed. Keanu raised a finger, indicating she should wait, and unhurriedly made the call. Yes, it's me, he said after a brief call. I'm at the dealership. Yes, Aurum Autos. Let them know I'm here. Thank you. Eloise stood rooted to the spot, her eyes wide. I'm sorry, but who did you call? She asked, but her voice was no longer as confident as it had been a minute ago. Keanu merely shrugged, putting the phone back in his pocket. You'll find out soon, he said calmly. The scene grew tense. It seemed as if the entire showroom had fallen silent, and the surrounding employees exchanged nervous glances. At that moment, Keanu simply waited, but his faint smile, almost mocking, spoke louder than any words. The silence in the dealership was deafening, with only the sound of the air conditioner and the muffled ticking of the wall clock reminding that time was still moving. Keanu stood by the display car, barely touching its mirror-like surface. He was in no hurry, his manner remaining relaxed, but the atmosphere around him was charged with tension. Eloise Beckett, the sales manager, stood nearby, trying her best to maintain an appearance of control. Her usually impeccable posture seemed less confident, and her gaze nervously darted between Keanu and the other employees. I need to clarify, Eloise began, her voice a bit too harsh for comfort. You said you called the owner? Keanu turned his head to her and smiled faintly. Yes, I think he'll be interested to know what's happening here. She paused for a moment, then forced a strange smile that was more of a mask than a genuine expression. This is unusual. The owner rarely communicates with clients directly. Are you sure he will actually come? Keanu looked at her, his eyes steady but unyielding. I'm sure. This is his dealership, isn't it? Or maybe he left the management to someone who makes decisions based on someone's appearance? Her face flushed, but she quickly regained her composure. I'm sorry if you felt uncomfortable, she replied in an apologetic tone, though there was still a hint of irritation. I was just trying to be honest. Our cars are a luxury, and not everyone can afford them. I thought it would be better to direct you to a more suitable place to save your time. Keanu frowned and stepped closer, his gaze intent but not threatening. Eloise, right? He asked, glancing briefly at her name tag. She nodded, clearly a bit rattled. Let me clarify. You assumed I couldn't afford a car because… Why exactly? My clothes. The car I drove. My tone. Eloise looked away, shaking her head slightly. No, she said quickly, trying to smooth things over. I didn't mean to offend you, Mr. Just Keanu, he gently corrected. She exhaled, but her attempt to take control of the situation still looked uncertain. Keanu, I was just trying to be realistic. You know, we get customers who come in, act interested, but in the end, it wastes everyone's time. Keanu chuckled softly, and the sound made her freeze. So, you decided I was one of them? Interesting approach, Eloise. Her face flushed again. At that moment, the door to the showroom opened, and in walked a tall man with dark hair, dressed in a perfectly fitting dark blue suit. It was Simon Lawson, the regional director of Aurum Autos. His posture exuded confidence, and his eyes immediately found Keanu, lighting up with recognition. Mr. Reeves, he said, approaching with a wide smile. I'm glad you decided to stop by. Sorry to keep you waiting? Eloise froze. Her eyes widened, and the tablet she was holding tightly nearly slipped from her hands. Her face went through several shades from surprise to horror as she finally realized who was standing before her. Mr. Reeves? She echoed almost inaudibly. Keanu nodded slightly to Simon in greeting and replied calmly, Thank you for coming, Simon. I was interested to see how things work here. The impressions so far are interesting. Simon glanced at Eloise and then back at Keanu, his smile fading slightly. I hope we haven't disappointed you, he said cautiously. Keanu smiled faintly, almost to himself. Eloise and I had a little chat about how she decides who is suitable for this dealership. Very enlightening. Eloise tried to say something, but her voice faltered. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Simon raised his hand, stopping her. Eloise, let's discuss this later. Right now, it's important to talk to Mr. Reeves. But Keanu raised his hand, signaling that her apologies did not interest him. Simon, let's make this simpler. You've known me for a long time. What would you think if someone treated me the same way in one of my other dealerships? Would you consider it normal? Simon tensed, his smile disappearing. Of course not, Mr. Reeves. This is absolutely unacceptable. Keanu nodded. Good. Then tell me, what are you going to do about it? Eloise opened her mouth to object, but fell silent under Simon's gaze. The atmosphere in the room was at a boiling point. We will conduct additional training for the staff, Simon said, his voice confident but noticeably tense, and we will review our standards of customer interaction. Keanu smiled, but his smile was cold. Excellent. But first, I need you to gather all the employees. I have a few words I want to say. Simon nodded, glancing briefly at Eloise. She clutched the tablet as if it were her last lifeline. Of course, Mr. Reeves, Simon replied. This will only take a couple of minutes. Keanu stepped aside and sat on the nearest chair, calmly waiting for the employees to gather. He knew this would be an interesting conversation, but looking at Eloise's bewildered face, he couldn't help but wonder, would she be able to change her attitude, or was this her last mistake? In the conference room, located behind the glass walls of the dealership, there was a tense silence. The furniture, perfectly fitting into the modern interior with its chrome accents and white leather chairs, now seemed cold, detached, almost hostile. All the employees of Orem Autos, including Eloise, took their seats, casting quick, frightened, or curious glances at Keanu. Keanu stood in the center of the room, unmoving as a rock, his hands resting freely in his pockets. He looked relaxed, but every gesture and glance spoke of him being in charge. Simon Lawson stood by the wall like a guard, watching the situation but not interfering. Eloise sat closer to the end of the table, her back tense, her gaze fixed on the tablet as if seeking salvation in it. She knew she would be the center of this conversation and couldn't shake the feeling that this day would change her life. Keanu began to speak, his voice steady but authoritative. Thank you all for coming, he said, looking around at those gathered. I am Keanu Reeves, the owner of Orem Autos. For some of you, this might be a surprise, especially for those who saw me for the first time today. He paused, allowing his words to settle in the air. There were murmurs of surprise from some employees, their reactions ranging from curiosity to embarrassment. Eloise sank lower in her chair, avoiding eye contact. Today, I came here not as the owner and not as someone who makes decisions from afar. I came as an ordinary customer, just a person who wants to buy a car. He looked around the room. His eyes stopped on Eloise, who clutched her hands on her knees as if that could protect her. And here's what I learned. If I were truly an ordinary customer, I would have been made to feel unwelcome here. Keanu's gaze stopped on Eloise again, and she felt her cheeks flush. I realized that here, people are judged not by what they can bring, not by how they treat the matter, or even money, but by their appearance and assumptions. Eloise lowered her gaze but remained silent. Her face expressed a mix of shame and stubbornness. She was not used to being the object of such intense attention. Keanu continued, his tone remaining steady, but his voice becoming slightly more tense. Let me tell you one thing. No one should feel unwanted or unworthy walking through these doors. This is a car dealership, not an exclusive club. If we put barriers in front of people, we lose not only customers but also their trust and respect. And most importantly, we lose our reputation. The employees in the room looked dejected. Someone lowered their gaze. Others nervously shifted from foot to foot. Keanu allowed the silence to fill the room before speaking again. But this is not just one person's problem. This is a systemic issue. Each of you who looked at me today and thought, he doesn't fit in here, is also part of this system. He paused and looked at Eloise. Eloise, right? He asked, glancing briefly at her name tag. She nodded, obviously slightly disconcerted. Would you like to say something? He asked directly, not averting his gaze. Her heart raced. She knew she couldn't remain silent, but had no idea what to say. Summoning her will, she lifted her head and met his gaze. I made a mistake. And I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling but quickly regaining composure. Her words sounded sincere, but that wasn't enough to lift the burden of tension in the room. Keanu nodded slightly, as if accepting her apology, but his eyes held an expectation of something more. It's good that you acknowledge the mistake, he said, but apologies are just the beginning. What will you do to ensure this doesn't happen again? Not just with you, but with the rest of the staff? Eloise swallowed. She knew the answer to this question would determine her future in the company. I am willing to learn, she said, her voice sounding a bit firmer. If you give me a chance, I will prove that I can change. Keanu looked at her for several long seconds, then turned to the others. Does anyone have any questions? He asked, scanning the room. Silence. No one dared to speak. Even Simon, who usually was ready to take the initiative, remained silent. Keanu sighed and straightened up. Good. Then listen carefully. From this moment on, we will have new standards. We will conduct training so you know how to treat customers, how to create an atmosphere of respect and openness. This is not up for discussion. If anyone feels they cannot or do not want to be part of these changes, you can leave right now. His words sounded harsh, but they were not a threat. It was a statement of fact, and everyone understood that. No one moved from their place. Keanu smiled faintly, almost to himself. Excellent. Then let's start over, because if there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's that everyone deserves a second chance. The question is how you use it. He looked at Eloise one last time. You have a chance, Eloise. Don't miss it. Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. At that moment, she understood. Her fate was in her hands. Keanu turned to Simon. Simon, start organizing the training and make sure everyone knows this is not a punishment. It's an opportunity. Of course, Mr. Reeves, Simon replied, nodding. Keanu took a step back, looking at the employees. And now, back to work, because we are here to improve. The employees began to rise from their seats, the atmosphere now heavy but with a sense of renewed purpose. Eloise remained seated a bit longer, reflecting on how much this day had changed her. The day after the meeting turned out to be surprisingly quiet. There was a sense of tension in the air at Orem Autos, as if each employee felt that this day would determine their future. From the outside, the dealership continued to shine, attracting passers-by with its glitz. But inside, there was silence, broken only by the soft sound of footsteps and hushed voices. Eloise Beckett sat at her desk in the corner of the office. Before her lay a tablet with a schedule she had been trying to decipher for several minutes. But her thoughts kept returning to Keanu Reeves. His words from the meeting still echoed in her mind like an echo. What will you do to ensure this doesn't happen again? This question had lodged itself in her consciousness and refused to leave. Her hand slowly reached for the black folder labeled Clients. But instead of opening it, she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She knew she needed to change, but how? Meanwhile, Keanu was in a small meeting room where sheets of paper detailing future changes lay on the table before him. Simon Lawson sat across from him, holding his notepad and trying to maintain his composure, though the tension was evident on his face. So, Simon, Keanu began, pushing the sheets of paper aside, who on the team do you think can adapt to the new standards? Simon scratched the back of his head, carefully choosing his words. Most of the staff can handle it, but honestly, Eloise, she's not one to change easily. She's used to being tough. It's in her nature. Keanu slightly raised an eyebrow, his gaze thoughtful. People change, Simon. Sometimes they just need to be given a chance. A chance, yes, Simon agreed cautiously. But whether they take that chance, that's another question. Keanu smiled faintly, but his eyes held a steely confidence. We'll see. I've encountered many people who seemed incapable of change. Most of them surprise you, but I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Let's see her actions. By evening, Keanu stepped into the main hall of the dealership. His calm demeanor and confident stride drew the gazes of the employees. He walked past the row of cars and stopped next to a young artist who was hesitantly examining a silver sedan. The young man was dressed in a loose shirt and worn jeans, his hands stained with paint as if he had just been working on another painting. Beautiful car, Keanu remarked, looking at the sedan. The young man started slightly, not expecting anyone to speak to him. Yeah, but I think this is not something I can afford, he muttered, nervously averting his gaze. Keanu smiled, stepping closer. Are you sure about that? Maybe you'll surprise yourself. The guy looked at him with disbelief but held his attention as Eloise appeared from the adjacent department. Her gaze immediately fell on Keanu and the client. Inside her, something tightened, but she forced a strained smile, which was more of a mask than a genuine expression. "Good evening," she said, her voice a bit softer than usual. "Can I assist you?" The guy looked embarrassed and stepped back, but Keanu remained in place. "I think our friend here wants to know more about this car," Keanu said, nodding toward the sedan. "What can you tell him?" Eloise hesitated for a moment but quickly composed herself. "Of course, this is one of our latest models, economical, comfortable, and perfect for city driving." She paused, looking at the young man. "What do you do, if you don't mind me asking?" "I'm an artist," he replied, lowering his voice slightly. "But you know, it's not the most stable profession. I just came to look." Eloise nodded, her gaze softening slightly. "Artists know how to appreciate details. That's an excellent quality for choosing a car. If you'd like, I can tell you more about this model and help with financing. We have great options for all clients, regardless of their profession." Keanu watched her intently. She spoke sincerely, though her voice still trembled slightly. He saw the first signs of change in her actions. The young man looked surprised but interested. "Really?" he asked, his eyes lighting up. "Usually, I don't get offered such things." Eloise smiled, this time more genuinely. "At Aurum Autos, there is a place for everyone. Let me show you how it works." As the evening drew to a close, Keanu watched the young artist leave the dealership with a printout of offers and a slight smile on his face. Eloise stood at the counter watching him go. Her face expressed a mix of emotions: relief, doubt, and perhaps pride. Keanu approached her, standing beside her. "Good job," he said simply. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with a hint of excitement. "I tried," she replied, shrugging slightly. "But I'm not sure he'll come back." Keanu smiled. "That's not important. What matters is that you showed him respect. That's the first victory." Eloise nodded but looked like she wanted to hear more. "Do you think I can do it?" she asked softly. Keanu looked at her, and his eyes held that familiar spark of confidence. "Everyone has a chance, Eloise. The question is how you use it." Several days had passed since Keanu Reeves announced his plan to change the culture at Aurum Autos. The atmosphere in the dealership was still tense. Employees felt that something was changing, but no one knew where it would lead. People did their jobs with more caution, watching each other's every move, and the shadow of Keanu's presence constantly reminded them that the time for biased decisions was over. Eloise Beckett, who was affected the most, felt particularly vulnerable. Her usual confidence was shaken, and every step she took reminded her that she was under intense scrutiny. She decided that the only way to deal with the situation was to show Keanu that she could change. At the morning meeting convened by Simon Lawson, the employees gathered around the table in the conference room. Keanu once again took his place at the center, and his presence was felt in every corner of the room. His gaze was calm but intent, like someone who sees more than he says. "Thank you all for coming," Simon began, opening his notepad. "Today we will discuss the new principles of customer interaction and the changes we will start implementing." He turned to Keanu, giving him the floor. Keanu stood up and looked around at everyone. "I understand that change is never easy," he began, his voice steady and confident. "But if we want this dealership to continue to thrive, we need to change. And it's not just about money. It's about making every customer who walks through these doors feel respected, heard, and important." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Today we will start with a simple exercise. I want each of you to imagine that you are not a manager, not a salesperson, not an administrator. You are a customer." The room fell silent. The employees looked at each other, some appearing puzzled, others clearly skeptical. "I want you to imagine yourself in the role of someone walking into this dealership. What do you feel? How are you greeted? What assumptions are made about you?" He continued. He looked at Eloise, holding her gaze. She felt a slight pang of anxiety but lifted her head and nodded. "Eloise," he said, "let's start with you." Her heart raced faster. She straightened up, trying to cope with the surge of nervousness. "All right," she said, trying to sound confident. "If I were a customer, I would want to be treated with respect, without judgments, without assumptions, just as a person." Keanu smiled. That's an excellent answer. And now think about what needs to be done to make every customer feel that way. What steps would you take? Eloise pondered, her gaze momentarily drifting to the window. I suppose I would spend more time talking to the customer. First, listen to what they need, and then offer options, not judging by how they look or what they wear. Excellent, Keanu said. And that's exactly where we will start. He turned to the other employees. You all need to understand that customers come here not just for cars, they come for an experience. This includes not just the purchase, but also respect, attention, and understanding. We will work to make this our core value. Simon nodded, making notes in his notepad. We will also start implementing a feedback program, he added. Every customer will be able to leave their opinion on how they were treated, and we will use this feedback to improve our processes. Keanu looked at Eloise again. Eloise, you said you want to change. This is your chance. Are you ready to take on the task of working with feedback? She slightly furrowed her brow, surprised by such an offer. Me? She asked. But I'm not sure I can handle it. Keanu smiled, his gaze softening. I'm sure you can. This is not a test and not a punishment. It's an opportunity to show that you are willing to work on yourself. I believe in you. Eloise sighed but nodded. All right, I'll try. After the meeting, Keanu stayed in the room to talk to the employees one-on-one. When it was Eloise's turn, she approached him with her tablet in hand. Can I ask a question? She began. Of course, Keanu replied. What made you believe that I could change? Many would have just decided I was useless after the first mistake. Keanu looked at her, his gaze deep and thoughtful. I've seen people change, he said, but for that, they need a chance. If someone in my life hadn't given me that chance, I wouldn't be standing here. I believe that everyone has potential if given the opportunity to unfold. Eloise silently nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. I won't let you down, she added. You've already proven you can handle it, he replied with a slight smile. By the end of the day, Keanu watched the dealership at work, but this time from a different angle. He saw how the employees were more engaged, how the customers smiled, and how the atmosphere of the dealership came to life. He felt pride, not for himself, but for them, for those who decided to change. As he left the dealership, his gaze lingered on the Orem Auto sign. It was no longer just a company name. Now it was a place where people were valued. Real people, without judgments, biases, or cold numbers. Keanu sat in his old car and started the engine. He smiled, looking in the rearview mirror. It's only just beginning, he murmured, shifting into gear. And with those words, he left the dealership, leaving behind not just a company, but a legacy that inspires change, not just in business, but in people.